I've played a lot of games and I talk about a lot of games, but sometimes I get a wild hair up my ass to branch out and talk about things I usually don't think about. Commercials. Previously, I released a pair of episodes talking about the best and the worst NES commercials out there, and I figured I'd continue that path of doing the exact same for the Super Nintendo. I sat through hours of archive footage of Super Nintendo commercials, and it was unique. I had a blast getting a glimpse of how some people learned about video games from a time where I wasn't really cognizant of the industry. Today, I'm going to talk about what is, in my opinion, the worst 10 Super Nintendo commercials. That being said, this is subjective, and I understand that in your youth, these commercials were probably the highlight of your life, so please take this with a grain of salt. It's just an opinion. I can't remove these memories from you. They'll be there forever. Oh, and before anyone says, the AVGN just released a commercial episode. Yeah, he did, but I had this planned already, so fuck it. Let's begin. Donkey Kong Country was a huge deal when it came out because for the most part the entire Donkey Kong lineage was going downhill really fast. Donkey Kong 1 was a pioneer of the industry, Donkey Kong Jr. was alright. Jesus. But Donkey Kong 3 was a trash heap in comparison to the previous games. The only major home iteration we got moving past the original arcade releases was Donkey Kong for the Game Boy in 1994, and to me, most franchises that began on more powerful hardware go to the handheld spectrum to die. It's a very risky move in the gaming industry to do that. Now, Rare wasn't previously a part of Nintendo. In fact, the only reason Nintendo took interest in Rare was because Rare was working on a boxing game demo that used a graphics engine by Silicon Graphics, specifically the SGI system. When I did my interview with Grant Kirkhope, he mentioned that Rare basically reverse engineered a NES game and showed it to Nintendo, and they saw potential in it. They liked it and allowed Rare to create something from a catalog of characters. They chose Donkey Kong. And what resulted was one of the best games on the system if you're into platformers, and if you're into Donkey Kong Country, of which I am into neither. But how are the commercials? Let's see. So, two things. In the 90s, if you had epilepsy or you had some photosensitivity issues, you were just hashtag fucked in the 90s. The second thing is, this is the style of ads that many companies ran in the 90s. Sega was just as guilty. These quick cuts, these obnoxious flashbang transitions, big bold words, some guy's basement guitar shred session, and of course, fuck Sega, right? It was the era of Nintendo vs. Sega, the most memorable console war to date, and it carried a huge budget too. The problem I have with this ad is that it's fucking horrible. They showed the game box for like 4 entire frames. The rest of it is whatever mescaline-fueled nightmare the designer had the night before. At least they showed footage of the game, I guess props for that, but get used to that style of ad. It's not going anywhere, and I'm sure it'll end up on this list again. There were a few catchphrases that Nintendo used throughout the years. The big one was, "Now you're playing with power," which was used for the NES as well as the Game Boy. As time went on, it transitioned to, "Now you're playing with power. Superpower." But in the later years of the Super Nintendo, they had this weird initiative known as Play It Loud, which made no fucking sense. The Play It Loud aspect was actually for the Game Boy, which I guess was louder. The big thing was that these Game Boys came in different colors, which would set a precedent moving forward for all of the Nintendo handheld consoles. I've seen purple SPs, silver Game Boy Pockets, transparent Game Boy Advances, even my Game Boy Color was atomic purple. I actually owned the high-tech, transparent Play It Loud Game Boy. Here it is. Wow. But here's the Super Nintendo version of the ad campaign, and let's see what it looks like.
I think it's every parent's dream, maybe, to have a doctor in the family.
Go forth and thrash!
So there is no method or madness to this at all, just dumb shit coming across the screen to remind you that, hey, the Super Nintendo exists. Here's some half-assed footage of our curated titles we want you to buy. Quick cuts, flash banging, big bold words, and some guy's basement guitar shred session. No fuck Sega this time though, shockingly. It's just a shitty commercial, I'm not big on it. Mortal Kombat was a huge deal. It was one of the major reasons we have the ESRB. It was a pioneer of the fighting genre alongside Street Fighter 2, and to this day, it holds up incredibly well, at least in the arcades. I'm not a big fan of the home ports. Mortal Kombat 1 was simple, 2 was hard as fuck, and now we had 3 at a time where many companies were hopping to 3D, and Midway didn't want to do that yet. Engaging by Mortal Kombat 4, I'm kind of glad that they didn't. I'm a huge fan of the franchise though, always have been and I always will be. I think one of the reasons I enjoyed Mortal Kombat right out of the gate is that while there was a subtle plot, it really didn't matter, and I think most fighting games shared that notion. Yeah, there was lore, but we just played it to kick the shit out of each other. But the question is, how was the third iteration advertised? Only one way to find out. Let's check it out. This is pretty horrible, and what's insane to me is that the commercial for the first Mortal Kombat game was awesome. I'm sure many of you remember it. There was a kid in an empty alleyway and he screams, "Mortal Kombat!" And kids from all demographics and age ranges flooded to the streets. It really showed how culturally relevant the arcade game was. But then we see the commercial for 3 and I don't know what's going on. He's getting medevaced out of a helicopter, he's pregnant, his fucking water break or something? I'm vividly confused. I think as a kid, I wouldn't have been interested in this at all. The commercial just sucked. I've always wanted to play Super Mario RPG, but I have this strange crossroads that I needed to address on stream. For anyone who watches my stream, you'll know I commit to a self-imposed rule set known as the Rules of Release. I do this so I can observe the evolution of video gaming as it relates to companies, genres, and franchises. Logically, this falls in the Mario franchise, but with Mario having a total of over 200 games, there needed to be a caveat. So I broke up Mario into multiple sub-franchises, and hopefully one day I'll be able to check it out. I'm familiar with it now, but back then, this was the commercial that aired.
All was peaceful in the Mushroom Kingdom. Till Smithy the sword shattered the Star Road. Wow! So with his old enemy Bowser and a marshmallow who throws lightning. Are you bought evil wedding cakes and the killer Venus flytraps and recovered the 7 stars? That was freaky.
Super Mario RPG, only on the system that keeps on kicking. Super NES.
Dig it?
You know, using a grandpa to tell a story, that's actually a pretty cool angle. Shining in the Darkness did it the second we started the game. But the grandpa in this scene, he's a fucking lunatic. He's screaming at these kids, telling them about Super Mario RPG. It's like he's stuck between a PTSD episode after remembering the Battle of the Bulge, and he's just conflating Mario with his experiences during the war. He goes apeshit. Could you imagine having this grandpa and the Legend of Zelda warehouse guy sitting in the same room talking about their respective games? It would be a madhouse. But hey, do you dig it? Home Alone is one of those games that got a biblical amount of buffoonery through the years. It's known as one of the worst NES games, and unfortunately the sequel didn't really make much headway in the human mental tangibility realm, right? In the older game, we essentially had a 20-minute simulator where the wet bandits are trying to kill us. We have to set traps and hope we didn't get put in a corner. And the Super Nintendo iteration was basically the same, except we were placing treasures in the basement. Home Alone 2 was released on 3 mediums, Game Boy, NES, and the Super Nintendo, and it's a little bit different. It's more of a platformer. From hell. Let's take a look at the commercial.
Remember that old saying, it's better to give than to receive?
Yes!
Well, give yourself a thrill with the new Home Alone 2 Super Nintendo video game, also available for your Game Boy and Nintendo Entertainment System.
So if you've watched my previous episode concerning the worst NES commercials, which I'll link down below and at the end of this video, I mentioned that one of my biggest pet peeves for games that align with a movie tie-in is the over-reliance on movie footage. Home Alone on the NES was not loved, so you would think that maybe they would try a little harder in the development world and by proxy, the advertisement world, but no. They gave it 15 seconds. To me, this game really isn't that great. In fact, for a long time, this game averaged about $1.50 loose. Ooh, yikes. At least people knew this game existed, even if it was just for 15 seconds. Data East is an incredibly important company. When it came to arcade games, especially in the 80s and the 90s, you might know them for their extremely successful games. Kung Fu Master, one of the first beat-em-ups, Karate Champ, one of the first fighting games, and Commando, which was developed by Capcom, but it was published by Data East in the United States. It's one of the most influential run-and-gun games. As most companies tended to transition to the home console market, Data East naturally did the same, making games for almost every console out there. In fact, Data East USA was the first licensee allotted by Nintendo, and due to that, they were one of the first 4 third-party developers allowed to publish games on the NES. Their reputation was massive. But it's the era of the Super Nintendo. What do we have in store from them?
Hello? 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 Where is everybody?
Outrunners for Sega Genesis and Fighter's History for Super Nintendo. It's too hot to play outside.
I get it. I get it. I get it. Commercials of this era were all over the place. We've already seen the eccentric loud guitar solo flashbang shouting era. We also had disgusting commercials, but the third option were the commercials that were incredibly abstract, and this is an example of exactly that. Now, the 2 games mentioned, they were massively fun games, and it's a shame that the only smidge of information we got about it stems from a kid going from a ballpark to the Sahara Desert. I think they could have done it a little bit better, maybe focused more on the games, or maybe they didn't want to, because Capcom was suing the daylights out of them for potentially infringing on their copyright for Street Fighter 2. If you're curious about that lawsuit, I did mention it in a few videos. I know it's in one of the scandal videos, but I do believe I spoke about it for the top 10 most important video game lawsuits episode, if you want to check it out. Yoshi! Now that's a character we all know and love. Ever since he was introduced in Super Mario World, people have been loving that little green pack mule, and I was overjoyed to be able to play him in Super Smash Bros., Mario Kart 64, and Mario Party. His one little introduction was enough to catapult him into a level of relevance that rivaled Mario. But we all wanted a sequel to Super Mario World, and we not only got an amazing sequel, we had one of our new favorite characters leading the helm. Yoshi's Island was a phenomenal game with some of the coolest artwork that I ever saw on the Super Nintendo. But how was it advertised?
When is too much, too much? To find out, we crammed everything into Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. 60 more levels, massive enemies, huge Yoshi tricks, all served up with the latest graphic technology, Morphmation.
No more.
Sure you don't have room for another little bonus level? Super Mario World 2, only on the Super NES. Still the big one.
This is hands down one of the most disgusting commercials I have ever seen, and you might be wondering, what depraved mind did this idea manifest from? The answer is Kinka Usher, who is already well known for outrageous and off-the-wall commercials. In fact, that style was used heavily. He did commercials for Got Milk, Taco Bell, Miller Lite, Nike. He even eventually directed his own movie, Mystery Men, in 1999. But if we return to the commercial, I feel that the shock factor really isn't appropriate. We actually see the guy explode, we see his innards be sprayed across people in a diner. That's fucking disgusting. And while I'm sure it was a conversation point for the kiddos who saw it in the 90s, I fucking hate it. It's gross. Ugh. As time went on, Nintendo transitioned from their normal ads to consistently more abstract ones, those usually aligned with the Play It Loud campaign. In this commercial, we'll see references to some of the best sellers for Nintendo, but it's weird, and in my opinion, it's kind of just a buffer. Let's take a look. Yep, that's all the time we got. But what did we see in those few seconds? We saw Samus, we saw Blanca, Kitana, Guile, and then, of course, the flashbang. Hell yeah. Super Metroid, Super Street Fighter 2, and Mortal Kombat 2, and more. These games led to millions of games being sold. But there's some buffoonery afoot. The biggest one is, who the fuck is this tattoo artist? I'm all for tattoos. I especially love video game tattoos. My left arm is a sleeve that's arcade themed, and it's my family tree. But if the artist drew characters on my body permanently that looked anything like the ones in this commercial, I would birth a cosmic Lovecraftian entity from my asshole born from disgust, hatred, and disappointment. Also, what's up with that copy of Mortal Kombat 2? It says Kung Lao fighting Kung Lao, but that's Raiden going up against Scorpion. What gives? I do like the vignettes from each game, but again, this boils down to a strange context used to simply occupy commercial space. To be fair, Sega was kind of guilty of the same thing. Ghosts 'n Goblins was a massive cult classic game. In many ways, it's one of those rite of passage games, one of the hardest too, and to be honest, that difficulty has never changed. As a franchise, this has consistently been the get good franchise from Capcom. The same as Contra when it came from Konami. The sequel Ghouls 'n Ghosts was even better. In fact, to date, it's my favorite game in the franchise. But then Capcom ported Super Ghouls 'n Ghosts to the Super Nintendo, and well, to me, it's severely underwhelming. The game runs horribly, but that's just my opinion. Let's look at an advertisement for it. Brother, the flashbangs! Why did directors feel this was an effective method of marketing? It 100% detracts from the viewing experience. I will say I like the tie-in with some old-ass horror movie footage. I think it's Nosferatu. In fact, in Castlevania on the NES, the ending had tons of references to previous Hammer films. But Ghosts 'n Goblins doesn't really use traditional monsters. I mean, we have zombies, but we also have demons, and we have whatever the fuck that is. Apparently it's a woody pig. I call it a spear burrito, but what do I know? I'm just some boy. They show some footage, some kind of relative monster from the other films. It's just kind of awkward. Then you supplement all of that with a tremendous amount of flashing, and to me that's the hallmark of a dreadful commercial experience. What do you think? Do commercials that flashbang you irritate you, or do you think that aligned with the energy of the 90s? Feel free to tell me down below. I do read every single comment, even the mean ones. Street Fighter 2 was a massive game. To me, it's the fundamental standard for tournament fighters. It was successful, it was competitive, and it was the cash cow that finally dethroned Mega Man for Capcom and ushered in a new wave of potential for Capcom on multiple spectrums. The arcade, the home console market, even the esports arena aspect of gaming. It was so successful that they kept birthing out new iterations left and right. To my knowledge, there are at least 7 different versions. That's how it's always been. Capcom will create a solid game, then they enhance it over and over and over again. Street Fighter 2 is one of the top 10 selling games for the Super Nintendo, and it was advertised like this. So this seems to be a lot like the Super Ghouls 'n Ghosts commercial, a format where they show game footage and correlate it to old-ass footage. E Honda's slap is aligned to a vaudeville slap, Blanca's electricity leads to some old dude with a lightning clap. Everything is represented. But what was that exit sound? As much as I appreciate the correlation to the old archive footage, nobody playing these games would have known anything about it. I feel like it was some false reference and that it could have been done so much better. And while we're at it, I'm gonna throw in a late edition honorable mention. Here's the commercial for Super Street Fighter 2. It's just as chaotic, but no references, just chaos. And that's it for today's list. What did you think about it? Are there any commercials for the Super Nintendo era that made you scratch your head or even possibly made you change the channel? Feel free to tell us down below. I know the community would love to hear about it. I know that I would. Speaking of our community, if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home here. We're a gathering of video game enthusiasts that love to remember when life was just a little bit easier to live. And if you align with that, you'll fit right in, so feel free to subscribe. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.